Last week, the Vice President of the United States told us that a riot that happened here in the U.S. Capitol last year was the equivalent of the day in which Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor and the U.S. was pulled into a world war that took the lives of over 3% of the world's population. And yesterday we were treated to the President telling us that election laws that are being passed by various states across the country over the last year are basically the same, the equivalent of the segregation that existed in this country in the 1950s and 60s and before. Now look, if your daily routine is to wake up in the morning and turn on MSNBC as you ride your Peloton, and then you go on Twitter as you're drinking your caramel macchiato, and then you're reading the New York Times as you're eating your avocado toast, I imagine all this makes perfect sense to you. After all, for these people, they believe this ridiculous narrative that every Republican is an insurrectionist, probably a racist, wants to overthrow the U.S. government, and wants to destroy democracy. The good news is that the overwhelming majority of Americans happen to live back here on planet Earth. And what they're worried about, to the extent they even paid attention to any of the stuff that's been said over the last 2 weeks, what they're really worried about is the fact that everything costs more. You go to the grocery store and the shelves are empty. They have a small business and they hire someone on Monday who just disappears on Thursday and never comes back. You've got every day thousands of people illegally entering the United States across an open border. And by the way, we have a surge of violent crime and lawlessness across the country. That's probably what they're worried about. In fact, I know it is on a daily basis. But to the extent they've paid attention to any of this, let me tell you something. First of all, I think almost everyone would tell you that what happened on January 6th here was a terrible thing. It should never have happened, and it should never happen again. But I don't care how many candlelight vigils and musical performances you have from the cast of Hamilton. You're not going to convince at least most normal and sane people that our government last year was almost overthrown by a guy wearing a Viking hat and Speedos. Okay? And I don't care how many of these speeches the president gives in which he shouts out this hyperbole and all this melodrama. You're not going to convince people that having a state pass a law that says, for example, that you have to produce an identification is the same as segregation. Nevertheless, despite the fact that that's what most people in this country are worried about is inflation and all these other things, that's not what we're working on here. That's not what we'll spend this week on. That's not what the priority of this administration has been. That's not what the president is giving speeches about. They don't care. You may care about inflation back home. They care about the fact their crisis is that there's some laws in this country, for example, some states in this country that do not automatically force everyone to register to vote. They just automatically register everyone. That's the crisis. They don't care that store shelves are empty. In fact, they've denied that the store shelves are actually empty. For them, the real problem is that states have laws, for example, that don't allow these roving gang of activists to bully people into turning over their ballot so they can show up at 6:59 p.m. on Election Day and just dump it on an elections official. And by the way, they don't seem overly concerned that there are Americans that will be fired or not allowed into a restaurant unless they can produce their papers, their vaccine card. The real problem is how dare you ask them to produce a voter ID, a photo ID in order to vote. That's their real problem. So how can this be? I mean, how can there be such an enormous disconnect between what real people in the real world care about and are talking about on a daily basis and what we're going to spend our time talking about here in these speeches that have been given over the last week? It isn't about the Capitol riot. Everyone agrees the Capitol riot was terrible and shouldn't have happened, I think. Most everyone does. But these are some of the same people that downplayed. Over 700 riots, thousands of cases of looting that happened in America in the summer of 2020. It most certainly isn't about election laws that have been passed in the last year. They've been pushing these same bills with different titles and different names. They've been pushing all of this for the better part of a decade. And it certainly isn't about voting rights. It is easier than it has ever been in the history of the United States to register to vote and to vote. And the proof is that in 2020, we had the highest turnout in over 100 and something years. This isn't about any of that. If you're paying attention, let me tell you what this is about. This is about power. This is about power. This is about changing the rules of the Senate so they have the power to ram through an election law. And this is about ramming through an election law to make sure that they never lose power, to make it easier to win elections for them, and therefore have power for perpetuity. You want to talk about defending democracy? Let's talk about the Americans, real people, who are afraid to donate to a political campaign, to put a bumper sticker on their car, to tell people who they voted for. They're afraid because they don't want to get canceled, they don't want to get boycotted, they don't want to get harassed. So they're afraid. They want to get smeared. Want to talk about totalitarianism? Let's talk about the fact that the Attorney General of the United States has said, let's go after some of these parents complaining at school boards and treat them as domestic terrorists. And listen, if you want to talk about segregation, then let's talk about a system of education that is both separate and unequal, divided between the people who can afford to spend $50,000 or $60,000 a year to send their kids to a fancy school where they get SAT tutoring and they get all kinds of advantages, and the thousands, no, millions of American parents that are Hispanic and African American and others who have no choice whatsoever as to where their kids go to school. They have no voice. They have to send their kids to the school the government tells them. These people don't care about any of this because it's about power. It's not just the power to change election laws. We've seen it. It's about the power to tell you what you're allowed to say. It's about the power to tell you where you're allowed to go. It's about the power to tell you what you're allowed to do. It's about the power to intimidate, to destroy, to smear, to call a racist, a bigot, a hater, anyone who dares get in your way, anyone who dares disagree with you. It's about the power to do that. Well, let me tell you something. I was raised by and have lived my entire life alongside people who lost their country, the country of their birth, to power-hungry people just like that. I warn you, do not stand by and allow it to happen to this one. I yield the floor.
Ooh. You could roast a marshmallow over the flamethrower that was that speech. Marco Rubio, where did that come from? Urgent address right now. Marco Rubio needs to have emergency surgery to remove the second spine that he just grew by giving that speech. Incredible. He touched on everything. But most important point, I think, it has never, ever in the history of this country been easier to vote, been easier to register to vote. We had a historic number of people voting in this last election, and this entire change the rules of the game when we're losing crap is going to backfire in their faces. Multiple people that I know inside of the Senate and inside of GOP leadership, let me tell you something right now, is telling me that this is dead. That not only Manchin and Sinema, but multiple other Democrats are saying they're not going to get rid of the filibuster. They're not on board with it. It is way too radical for Democrats from Ohio or Montana or whatever. The majority of the country is against them. And that is what scares the living out of them. They cannot conceive of a world where they have lost power and are stripped of power. And they know that exactly what is going to happen to them and their party when they lose power. They know that we have a base of FJB, LGB, Let's Go Brandon, patriots who are going to tell their elected officials and going to tell the people who represent them in Congress to do something about these insane radicals, these communists. Marco Rubio talking about his Cuban ancestry and the Cubans who, by the way, I have tons of Cubans in my neighborhood. I live in Tampa, Florida. Remember with searing pain the deaths of family members, the destruction of their homes, the destruction of their nation, because a tin pot tyrant, low IQ jackass who probably has a similar IQ level to Joe Biden right now and has a lot of consistencies with Joe Biden. Shutting down speech, crippling inflation, destruction of an economy, destruction of the private sector, going after patriots, going after small businesses, going after people who want to live in a free country, cracking down, creation of political prisoners and political others. That is exactly what Castro did. That is precisely what Joe Biden is doing today. The despicableness and the disgusting capacity to say that people who want voter ID are the same as segregationists. The venal, disgusting, rancid, putrid capacity for this diseased, old, syphilitic man to say that patriots who simply are against unmitigated drop boxes and mail-in ballots for every American to make sure that your vote is as cheap as the paper it's printed on, to say that we're the same as Bull Connor, people who stick to dogs on civil rights activists, you disgust me. Thank you for watching. We are 100% independent news. Are you sick of being lied to? We certainly are. That's why we started this channel. But we can't do it without you. We can't keep going without your help. All we ask is that you click like and subscribe and share this video. It's free and it keeps us going. It keeps us growing. And it keeps us getting the truth out there to break the rotted corporate media infrastructure that wants to lie to you every single day, wants to corrupt your narratives, your truth, your story, and your very society. So support us by clicking like, clicking subscribe, and thank you, Patriots.